Hello and welcome to the X Factor podcast. I'm your host, Charles Epstein, at least I believe and hope I am. I am welcoming to this podcast Alicia Miller, who leads AI literacy and adoption at the IRS, a workforce with more than 70,000 employees. Alicia is actively involved with AI communities with advisory board roles with the Kyle and Company Human-Centric AI Council and Cincinnati AI Catalyst, through which he advises HR teams, government agencies, and local businesses on how to adopt AI responsibly and with impact. Alicia, how are you?
I'm doing great. I'm very excited to be here.
Oh,
Thanks for having me.
same. Have to say right off the bat, we know, and this is sort of a through line in many of our podcasts, that AI is causing people a lot of anxiety. And I don't know if there are any three letters when grouped together that cause more anxiety in this language, in our culture, than the IRS. And you combine AI and IRS, it could be kind of rough, but we're going to try to
Yes,
de-escalate the
I'm
anxiety.
I'm excited about that. And you mention it, but I walk into a lot of conversations where as soon as people hear those three-letter words, I see their
Oh,
reaction.
yeah.
And we're also seeing those same reactions with the AI, like you mentioned. And it's one of those things where I really enjoy having the opportunity to talk about things in a ways that makes people feel excited, that makes people feel like they're going to have a positive experience. And that is what we're going to do today.
Excellent. Excellent. Anyway, Alicia, thanks so much for taking the time. Really do appreciate this. So I just want to ask you straight away. We had a very interesting conversation preparing for this, and you mentioned learning AI differently from the way most people learned AI. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So starting out, I found like a lot of people early on in their adoption journey were learning something called ChatGPT. And their initial experience was going in, learning how to prompt, just having a little bit of a conversational chat. And I took the approach of I didn't want to just learn how to use AI. I wanted to understand how it was built. So some of my early experiences with this kind of AI was actually going and learning from the engineers that built these systems. Now, it's a little bit different today. We're adding things like skills and working with them very differently. But I thought it was important, particularly as an architect and leader, where I wanted to understand how they were built, what decisions were being made, and if we're going to interact with these systems, knowing what are the questions I should be asking and what are the levers that we can change within them to help inform how we use them or develop them moving forward. And it was that experience of working and learning aside engineers, very eye opening, that introduced me to more deeper understanding of things like evals, guardrails, prompt injection, terms that we might use a lot more readily now, but at the time were less in the common vocabulary. And I also realized starting to go into conversations, even in AI literacy, that when these terms were thrown out, they meant different things. They were understood differently. So that really helped me in being able to reconcile the conversation between technical teams and lay
Yeah,
audiences as
it's
well.
kind of interesting because when we first spoke, you mentioned learning uh, AI. And I said, well, do you mean learning to use AI? You said, no, learning AI. And it occurred to me that, it was really tantamount to learning a language, particularly the way you approach it. It's like a foreign
Mhm.
language, and you need to learn the fundamentals, the building blocks, the grammar before you can speak conversationally, or in your case, use it and, promote its usage
Mhm.
internally. So, what are some of the complexities in the work you do promoting AI literacy and adoption?
Yeah. So let's talk about a federal context right now. And particularly in an agency like the IRS, we've actually been using AI for a long time. So if we think about AI generally, this is a field that's been around. This term is coined back in 1955, the first chatbot released in 1966. AI has been around a while, it's just done different things. And so from our side, we have over the past year moved into a direction where you've had very central, very technical teams working and overseeing AI to a more intentional, decentralized structure of putting AI ownership and responsibility into more functional units. With that, We also still have regulatory requirements of things like putting together AI use cases, releasing those publicly, and also other compliance mechanisms. So, as we started talking about AI, the thing that everyone is hearing about are these conversational chats. But suddenly, we need people to understand that AI is more than that. When we ask you to help with our compliance mechanisms, when we ask you to put together your use cases, it's more than how you're using systems like ChatGPT. You have to understand the full spectrum of things that are AI. So this has been very critical in our conversations in literacy is helping people to understand and recognize what is AI more broadly in all of its spectrums, and then also, how do we use it responsibly and how do you stay compliant with the
Yeah, we
regulations?
definitely want to dig a little bit deeper into that. That's really interesting. So, speaking of AI literacy, how do you define it? How do you assess it?
Charles, can you repeat that question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Speaking of AI literacy, how do you define it? How do you assess it?
Great question. And I don't think there's a universal answer across the board. When I've seen programs early on when we started rolling out tools, and for many, they've been using them for maybe 6 months. We talk about the current modern AI tools. So it still feels very new. But when you start rolling out these technologies, the immediate reaction is people need to learn them, they need training. So AI literacy for a lot of people meant go give my people a one time training.
Right.
And as we know, these technologies don't work well in that way. And so for many it was, hey, let's talk about just some early prompting. What does that look like? But when we talk about AI literacy, we also had to add in all of these other components, right? So what is AI generally? How do you use it responsibly? What are some of the governance components internally? There might be we deal with a lot of sensitive data. Not all of that can go into certain systems. So making sure people truly understand what they can and cannot do to be a responsible user of these systems and protect the data that we have access to and have good stewardship over, but it needs to go beyond that, right? We can't just give you this one time training. And so for me, where I have been working very closely internally is kind of changing the mindsets and helping people understand this is really about building learning cultures. It's around continuous learning and ecosystems that allow people to continuously evolve with these tools in a way that is more than just training, it's into actual adoption, usage, and transformation.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. What is different about AI adoption for government and highly regulated industries?
Yeah, the stakes are higher. Government gets a reputation for moving very slowly. Um, I don't think it's slow always in this particular sense. It's about moving responsibly and more deliberately. Because a lot of times when you look at highly regulated industries, including government, you're dealing with use cases that can seriously impact people's lives. And because of that, we need to have a little bit more precaution in how we go about implementing new systems. We have a higher bar for that accuracy. And I think the public would appreciate that, especially when we're dealing with systems, not just the IRS, but if these systems could make you go to jail, it could impact your financial situation. People could steal your identity. If there's any of these kinds of repercussions, you really have to act more responsibly.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I just want to actually take a step back and ask you what motivated you to work in the public sector? And having worked in the public sector for as long as you have, what are some of the common misconceptions people have about that work?
Yeah. So I came from a family of public servants. And for me, it was very much wanting to have an opportunity to positively impact my communities, to serve my country. I think these are very common reasons that people go into public service and government. And, a lot of times I do think people fear that they have this fear of government. And sometimes people get to know them as like, oh, maybe they're the bad guys or the people that come audit us. They take our money. But
Whatever makes you think that, Alicia?
I don't know. Maybe it's those three-letter words we
Yeah,
talked about. But at the end of the day, governments are very different. So if you talk about what is government, that is something that I also had to learn starting to work in local governments, that maybe working with, they do your libraries, they help with your public safety, they might do restaurant inspections to make sure that the food that you eat at restaurants are safe, right? All the way up to state governments. And then you have federal that also does different things. There's different levels of government. They do different things, but they're largely built around public interest, public safety, and things that you can't make a profit on, right? There's things that just help the common good. That's where they step in to help protect the public. And it's really important that people recognize that they are trying to do good. They also build a lot of bureaucracy in their processes. I think we get known for
Right.
that. Um, but the reason that they do it is to try to create fairness, consistency, and have an experience where everyone is treated equally and appropriately.
Yeah, I think some of the negative connotations or notions are based on are typically narrow interactions with government, which is the DMV,
DMV?
right? Not a lot of great experiences at the DMV, and of course, the IRS. But in my experience working with knowing people who've worked and work in the, excuse me, public sector, a lot of incredibly talented, accomplished, highly educated, motivated, committed people. I think that people who gravitate to that work get painted with a broad brush and unfairly so.
Yeah. I will say, let me reiterate that because I have worked with some absolutely brilliant minds, and the government actually does have some very interesting use cases that helps promote more innovation, and it brings together some smart people. I mean, we helped put people on the moon, right? If you think about everything that we're doing, even the start of the internet, a lot of these innovations that are so monumental today or things that are ingrained in our day-to-day living are actually because of things that are actually done in the government, funded by the government. And here we are. Again, very smart people. I've been very blessed with the experiences that I've had in getting to solve problems and just work with a very broad spectrum of different backgrounds, but highly skilled
Yeah. Okay.
people.
Well, I think we very successfully demolished all of these many myths. So, congratulations to the both of us, actually, mainly to you. But back to AI. We touched initially on the anxiety that it's causing. And again, that is a through line of many of our conversations and the Substack articles that we do with the X Files, etc. How is AI anxiety showing up in your environment, and what are you doing, or what are people doing to overcome that anxiety?
We talk about a couple different angles. One thing you also mentioned earlier about, highly regulated agencies. We are often looking at, when we engage in our day to day, the question that always comes up is like, what's going to end up on the front page? How do we stay off the front page in a bad way? Um, we've been there.
Yes.
And it's the trust. You want to maintain trust with the public. You want to maintain your credibility in your mission. And this is also something that's coming up, particularly when I talk to lawyers, whether it's my agency or others. We've seen the stories of people submitting briefs to the court with made up legal citations. It's these things that can help reduce your credibility. So, in situations when you want to have high accuracy and particularly stakes where you want to maintain trust, this is a barrier. And that has resulted in some places people saying, we don't want to use this. We want to stick with the old way. We want to make sure that we maintain that trust. Another side, which is very common here, is just individuals. They have been bombarded with these messages of AI is taking jobs. And I remember early on going into conversations where we were planning training sessions to introduce people to AI, introduce people just to conversational chats like ChatGPT. And the managers would tell us, our staff just want to know if this is going to take their jobs.
Yeah, of course.
And this was the direct statement that they were asking for. This is the reason that they wanted AI training was just to see this. So there's different kinds of AI that are out there and there's different ways that you could implement it. But particularly for these kinds of tools, there's two things that have really helped, which is one, we're coming into the conversation and showing them, demonstrating this is what it is. It's here to help you. And then it opens their eyes because if you haven't used certain tools, you don't know what this is, just seeing it
Yes.
helps. It gives you more calibration to what is
Yes.
this. The other thing is that although we've been talking about layoffs and aligning, you know, AI to these layoffs, in our situation, we've gone through a lot of upheaval over the past year where we lost a lot of people. And it wasn't because, it wasn't because of
Mhm.
AI. And so now we have teams across the board who are really trying to figure out, how do I regain capacity? And this is an entry point for us and saying, all right, let's look at what some of these technologies are that we're bringing in house. Let's see if there might be opportunities for you all and using this to help regain some of your capacity. So it's not about replacing people, your staff aren't there. It's about building back to where you were before and seeing how these efficiencies might be able to help you get there.
What are some of the cultural barriers to AI adoption?
Yeah. So it depends on the kind of AI, but I definitely see, especially being in environments where you have very high risk averse, change is hard for people. And so you have a lot of personalities sometimes that like very specific systems. They like to protect the systems that they have. Coming in with conversations of let's do things differently don't always resonate with people that like very secure, continuous kind of environments. It's not like the cultures where people are very creative and they're always looking for new ways of
Right.
doing things. And so that can be a difference. But also walking in, sometimes we really are getting to the point of saying we need to be looking at processes and how we can redo processes. And when you have organizations that have a lot of silos, this also reintroduces this fear of, okay, if you try to automate a piece of my process, that is going to be me feeling more unstable, like I'm losing some of my control over what I own, what I know, and that kind of anxiety also plays into a lot of fear and willingness to move through innovation cycles.
Yeah. I guess the Silicon Silicon Valley ethos, move fast and break things, is not going to work for places like the the IRS. I don't think you can get away with that kind of a thing. We talked about how organizations ought to, or how you define and assess AI literacy. How do you measure success vis-a-vis AI adoption?
Yeah. The measurement one is an interesting question because I've seen this evolution where it's gone from just training and adoption to what's the extent of use of these, all the way over to what's the ROI and business impact. And I'm not speaking just from like a federal context, but broadly, this is what I'm seeing as a progression of metrics. And what I'm seeing externally is people are doing things like, percent of code that's generated by AI. If you want to do that, people will find creative ways to meet those metrics. It's not all, it may or may not be translating into the business outcomes that you are expecting. But I definitely see two work streams of measures. One is on the individual side and people using it. I've seen, not that we're using it, but I have talked with others who are now bringing this into their performance commitments and they're bringing them into their evaluations of the extent that they're using AI. And that can be a difference between whether they stay, whether they get promoted, is their extent of AI usage. Um, on the other hand, when we're talking about reworking workflows, this is when you're getting into things like pilots, when you're getting into deploying completely new processes. And I think the agentic conversations are really going to get us there. Then measurement's different because you're not talking about the individual anymore. But if you start looking at the whole, then we start getting into what are the outcomes that are expected from a given process. And then if you start implementing these changes, are you actually generating those returns by changing those business outcome metrics? Sometimes with pilots, we come in and you can actually measure or forecast what you think the time savings were going to be. But now I think people are trying to move beyond just efficiencies into, especially in the private sector, much more of that P&L. Like, what are those specific things that we might be generating from this? In a government context, that doesn't always
Yeah.
exist. So we still look at, efficiencies.
Yeah, by the way, efficiencies, I think is kind of a double-edged kind of a word, particularly in the age of AI, because I think a lot of people
Mm, yes.
hear efficiencies, particularly these days, they hear headcount. The more efficient, the fewer people we're going to need to do
Yeah.
those things. So I think that's a word that may need to be more carefully couched in this particular moment.
That is a real friction. Absolutely.
People hear it in a certain way. You mentioned pilots, and I know you're a big proponent of pilots. Why is that? And um, are there any best practices or things that organizations need to look at when they implement pilots to ensure their effectiveness or their success?
Yeah, not everything needs to be piloted, which is the first thing to know. Sometimes, especially for things like these conversational tools, you might see them piloted for cost effectiveness, which is we're going to roll them out to a certain number of people just to measure what the extent of use is because we pay for that usage. Um, but it's not about actually piloting it in the way that we consider pilots. So a pilot would be something where you have some ambiguity. You're developing a new capability, but there's actually a measurable evaluation of what it is. So, for instance, we have um, a custom chat that people can use to interact with an employee manual. For something like that, you want it to deliver right answers. So, if you go with a smaller rollout, you can test it where suddenly you can start looking at um, how frequently is it delivering accurate answers.
Right.
How are people using it? When you start piloting that or piloting other workflows, it's really important because it helps you build your business case. Is it actually producing the generated value that you expect it to do? It helps identify bugs or if there's any, we call them edge cases, things that you might not have thought of when you're programming these systems. You can fix those before it rolls out, but you also have the opportunity for bringing people in to test them out and give you feedback, which can also inform your change management and bringing all of those lessons learned together to refine your product, build your strategies, and scale in a much more informed and responsible way. Another thing that I think is interesting for people that they may not realize. So, for me, coming from a background of working with research teams and we do experimental designs, there's very specific processes that are accustomed to us, but pilots often come with very defined measurement that some people don't always think of when they think of pilot. They're like, they test it and like, it kind of works. Move on.
Right.
It's good. Got good feedback. But when we think of things like pilots, we're actually thinking of more experimental designs where there is defined use cases, defined measurement, defined protocols. And let me give you an example of like a triage
Oh, I was going to
example.
ask you. Yes.
So this is a common potential use case for AI that has emerged. And a situation from that is, let's say some workload comes in and then you then have to adjudicate where does it go? Like IT tickets, various different things that could be used with a triage kind of process. So historically, you might have a human being who is reviewing and then assigning where it should go. You also can now have AI take on those kinds of tasks and reason an adjudication or push it in one work stream or another. If you were doing a pilot and you wanted to evaluate the system, one way that you might go about it is like some concurrent evaluations. So you have things in real environment come in. Maybe you have a human reviewer review things. You have that same workload reviewed by an AI. And we would take this as a process of then having a third party, like independent SME, come in and say, what is the right answer of what should the determination have been during that triage? And then you can compare the human output, you can compare the AI output, you can see how well they do. One thing that is surprising in these is that you might see situations, and we've seen this, where the AI doesn't always work 100%, as we know. But what we forget is that humans aren't perfect either. Sometimes you'll find during these pilots that the AI makes fewer errors than the human
Mm,
in a given
sure.
process. And that is something that I think has been a good lesson learned and thinking about where to deploy. It's not always the focus can be on like the AI wasn't perfect, but that doesn't necessarily need to be the problem because we as humans aren't either.
Yeah, not to sound flippant, but, I think I'd much rather an AI hallucinate, than have to witness an individual, a human being, hallucinating on the job. That may be a that may be an order of magnitude, more freaky, if you will.
It it's
Yeah, don't
you know, as you mentioned that though, there is another story that I thought was really impactful for me. Um, this is a colleague of mine, large private sector, where they implemented an HR chatbot. This particular organization decided to eliminate more of its HR staff, attempted to do this kind of chatbot, and the initial headlines were all efficiencies. But I'm talking to someone who used this system and they said, "You know what? There was an issue that I had. I went and talked with this system. Something that should have taken 1 hour that previously would have taken 1 hour now took me 3 days."
oh, wow.
It couldn't figure out how to understand what they were asking for or what actions to take to resolve it. And so, headline efficiency, the real story was lost productivity.
Yeah,
What we measure is important. It's not always about the efficiencies, like you said earlier.
yeah, interesting. Um, has your thought have your thoughts changed, over time? You've gotten to work and gotten more comfortable with the AI and seeing how it's evolved and how more and more people are gaining literacy and adopting it and using it. Um, has your thought process changed to any degree about human and machine collaboration? And have you become more or less concerned about responsible AI use? It's a big question. I know.
Big
Big
question.
question. I
Big
know.
question, Charles.
I know.
All of the things all at
I
once.
know. I know. These questions get a little bit more difficult as we go through. As the synapses get jostled.
Diving into the deep
Yeah.
end. I'm not as much concerned around individuals, but I do think there are strong risks, and we've seen the risks out there. What I continuously see now, you also know that I come from this behavioral science background, right? And so, one thing that we have learned, it's just been ingrained on me, is context matters. And and that we also realize that we need to test and evaluate things over time because the methods that work today, they may not work tomorrow. And so when I think about AI literacy in our training programs, I feel like there's such a shift. And when it comes to human and machines, let's just talk about literacy programs. We talked earlier about moving from one time training to what does continuous learning look like? What does learning ecosystems look like? It's not just about training people to start experimenting. We have to move into a direction of how can I use this for my role, which is what I hear a lot from people. There's some people that just you teach them how to experiment and they go and solve all kinds of new things. And other people really want very defined instructions. The problem is things are changing so fast, so rapidly that we need to adapt to that. We need to adapt our operating models, how we interact with that. And so that's where sometimes for our programs and trying to get people to work with machines, it's moving past the like, I've taught you how to prompt, move on. It's, I need you to make time for experimentation and practice with this. Let's talk about our use cases. Let's build some instructions to help make sure that you're getting the most out of what you're doing. And again, now things continuously evolve into a different way, agents, et cetera. So that kind of human machine collaboration is fine. I think we just need to change how we start learning to work with them. But the things that are more edge cases are in the situation of people want their digital twins, right? People are like, hey, let's bring this into the office. And now instead of talking to me, you can talk to my digital twin. There are scenarios of people saying, oh, now these AI systems might be able to detect depression before you know it. And is that something that a company should have access to? Um, there's there's these kinds of emerging scenarios where we're going to have to evaluate these and really determine, although things can be done, should they be done? What does this look like for an organization? But I think a lot of times in companies, it's really around we are getting into a brand new era of so many possibilities that we are figuring out as we go. And people are going to be testing out different things around what they feel comfortable with, the risk level in their culture for trying some of these different approaches. And we're going to learn from them and see where to go.
I think what I'm hearing from you is that it's a kind of a mindset and goes back to that idea of AI and learning AI as though it's a language. When you're first learning a language, you're slow, it's clumsy, it's a very conscious kind of a process. As you gain fluency, it's more natural, it's more fluid, and you can address your world in a more organic way. You're not or another good, I think, analogy or metaphor is music. Right? I mean, you learn to read music, it's a very deliberate process. But once you get really, really good at it and you're very good at sight reading, right? It's, you don't have to worry about the music. You don't have to worry about your fingering or the mechanics. It's a more fluid thing. So you could more deeply interact with the music and you can express
Yeah.
it. And no matter what music comes at you, right, you're going to be able to parse it out and play it.
Yeah. I think this is one of the real unlocks and starting to get where we are with individuals using these machines is that it can unlock new possibilities for us as an individual. I think there's some fears where there are definitely places where we might be able to consider some automation that changes the job availabilities for certain categories of work. And we're starting to see a little bit more of that from the research, but we are always going through changes. If you look at work dynamics over time, the categories of work in different sectors have continuously changed, and we're going to be going through that evolution. But I do see that there is emerging capabilities and new opportunities for people. We just need to be in a place where we actually learn how to work with these systems and build some subject matter expertise. So we're not just doing the routine work because that is something that has a higher risk of
So
automation.
you're on balance very optimistic about all this. What are you most excited about in the next 2, 3 years? I don't want to go
Yeah.
beyond that. Things are moving so fast. Go beyond 2, 3.
Yeah. It's like, can we even look that far
No,
out?
even 2, 3 is
Yeah. I will say there was one thing that I was reading recently that was around, agentic marketing, for instance. And it was mentioning how, you have processes where you can give individuals something like a copilot and they can produce their work much faster. But the end products were actually not being delivered to market faster because of the operating model. You had siloed work processes within very sequential steps, and those weren't happening any faster. And as someone who works in very large, very siloed organizations, like this resonates quite a bit. And now we have these predictions of not just workflow transformation, but the ability to come in and redesign processes. So, for someone who's worked and trying to help understand, not just understand, but how to break down silos my entire career, getting people to work together, redesigning systems, this provides an opportunity in twofold. One, for us to help unlock some creative abilities from individuals, that human machine collaboration. What does that look like? But a future of work where we actually take a step back and look at our organizational systems and designs to design for the future. How can we work in a way that's going to actually break down the systems that have been challenging us in the past to unlock the performance that is really possible?
excellent. At the outset, I said that AI is producing a lot of anxiety, and the IRS is obviously not exactly known for promoting, a peaceful mindset or relaxed mindset. But I think we work through this, and I really appreciate your insights, particularly coming from that organization. And it's not so much, I mean, we also had a very interesting conversation in the lead up to this about the IRS. And you made a really interesting point that, it's not so much the IRS being different from other organizations, public sector organizations, or even private sector organizations, but it's a matter of all large organizations behave in very similar ways. They're siloed. They have a lot of these same impediments
Mhm.
or same dynamics. And it's kind of interesting to get that perspective, or at least, the one that you shared about the particularities of your work with the IRS, but how it broadly applies to large organizations. And
Yeah.
there's obviously a good amount of applications to small organizations because everybody's
Yeah.
grappling with many of the same issues.
Charles, I think both of you and I had talked about too, where it's interesting for me when I go and talk to the private sector. Now I definitely see some leading edge companies that are moving forward a lot faster and we can learn from them. But if you turn back the clocks 5 or so years ago, I really had that experience of walking in and talking to private sector counterparts and finding that they're having the exact same challenges that I'm experiencing, or in some cases, we're actually further ahead on the innovation cycle compared to where they are in the conversation I was having around data and analytics. And so it just helps you recalibrate, but understand that it doesn't matter where you are. You are never alone in the challenges that are experiencing. There are others out there that are going through that exact one, and that's one of the areas we're finding community and having conversations about what's working and what's not. It's helping us all move forward together.
Yeah, excellent, Alicia. Thanks so much. Really do appreciate this. Have to have you
Thank
back
you,
on
Charles.
one a little bit down the road because I'm sure there are some other issues that we can talk about. So thank you so much.